Hello out there, we're on the air, it's hockey night tonight.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Lighting a Lamp podcast. I am here with Steve.
Hello.
As always, and this is going to be what we are calling kind of our quote-unquote outsiders podcast today, where we're just going to talk about the teams that are not in the playoff picture, kind of give them their last hurrah, their last mention, because from here on in, it's probably going to be all playoff teams all the time, unless something happens with one of these teams that's, newsworthy or worth talking about. Otherwise, sorry to say that we're probably not going to be talking about these teams again until the draft.
Yeah, and to be fair, there's really, not to sound like that guy, but there's really no reason going into March and April to be talking about a lot of these teams, because a lot of it's not newsworthy anymore.
Right.
I mean, the trade deadline's over, and that was kind of these guys' time to shine, right? Was to do something big and, headline grabbing. And some of these teams did. I mean, they made some moves, but going into the playoffs, I mean, the exciting talk is all about, what's the tournament that starts in April, and,
Yeah, so we're just more or less going to kind of go over the non-playoff teams, kind of talk about where they're at, the future going forward, just to kind of give them their last mention before, from here on in, it's all playoffs all the time. We do want to talk briefly about some NHL news really quick. We'll start with something that happened the other day that I'm sure everyone knows about. Montreal Canadiens legend Henri Richard passes away. I think it was 84.
84, I believe.
11-time Stanley Cup champion as a player, which is unbelievable. The Pocket Rocket, an absolute legend in his own right, even outside of the mythos of his brother. Just a world-class player in his own way, an absolute winner in every sense of the word. Obviously we didn't get to watch that era of hockey, but
no, but
all we've heard about these guys is good things on and off the ice. So, I don't know if you have any thoughts about.
I mean, he's part of arguably the greatest roster to ever play in the NHL in that late 50s Canadiens teams, right? I mean, and not for nothing, but he stood out. I mean, they wanted to make him captain, or never was captain of the team. Jean Beliveau was captain. I think he was captain for maybe 2 seasons after Jean Beliveau retired. But not for nothing, one of the most respected players in that locker room. And like you said, I mean, stepped out of the shadow of his brother, who's, arguably the greatest player of the first, 25 years of the NHL's existence. And, I mean, just an absolute animal in his own right. I mean, I never had the scoring feats that his brother did in terms of goal scoring. I don't think he ever eclipsed the 50-goal mark. I don't think he did anything like that, but was still just an animal. And like you said, an absolute winner in every sense. I mean, you don't win 11 Stanley Cups unless you're good at what you do.
It's just crazy that, it's hard to fathom an 11-time Stanley Cup champion when some of these players go through 20-25-year careers chasing one.
Right.
And this guy has his name on a cup 11 separate times. And, it's got to be hard following up Maurice the Rocket Richard, but he did it. And, he carved his own legacy out in the NHL. And, just like I said, just a winner in every sense of the word. So we want to extend our condolences to the family and friends of the late Henri Richard.
Yeah.
And on another note, a little bit more positive note, tonight Roberto Luongo gets his number 1 retired by the Florida Panthers.
It's almost like we called it.
Now, yeah, it's kind of setting up the Canucks, like saying, hey, now like the ball's in your court here, like his number 1's gone up in the rafters. The first player to have his number retired by the Florida Panthers. He will be the one and only number in the rafters so far.
I mean, yeah, I think the only other number you might be able to put up there might be Ed Jovanovski for
Jovocop.
Because, I mean, we saw Jovocop play at the end of his career, but from what I understand and what I've seen of, Jovocop coming out of the draft and, his early career with Florida was, the guy was good. He was really good, and he was a staple on that Florida Panthers team for a long time. I mean, he was, for all intents and purposes, like the Florida Panthers. He was the captain, I'm pretty sure. He was the face of the franchise. Never a high-scoring defenseman by any stretch, but
Just reliable.
He didn't have to be. I mean, like, Jovocop. He cleaned up your mess. He cleaned up your messes.
Cleaned up the streets.
Yeah, exactly. He cleaned up the messes, and, he was good at doing it. So, we want to extend our congratulations to Roberto Luongo in Florida. Well deserved. Over 2 tenures in the Panthers organization. Ball's in your court now, Vancouver. I mean, you have almost no reason not to. He's probably outside of Ron. I mean, he leads Ron McLean in almost every statistical category in Vancouver Canucks history. So, I don't know if McLean's number is up there, and if it's not, that's a crime. But Luongo's got to go up there, and
yeah, he's one of those rare players that he leads both the Florida Panthers and the Vancouver Canucks in wins, which is wild to think that he's a franchise leader for 2 separate franchises. Florida Panthers being a younger franchise than the Canucks, but that's still a very impressive thing to do, to go to 2 separate franchises and have over 230 wins in each.
I think what's especially impressive is the fact that he didn't play in Vancouver for that long. I mean, he went there in 2009, maybe 2010, probably 2008, 2009.
I don't remember.
And he was gone by 2015. So maybe he played 6-7 years there. I mean, that's a long time but not in the grand scheme of how long his career actually was. And I mean, to be the all-time franchise leader in wins in that short amount of time is.
He played for the Canucks from 2006, 07 to 13-14.
Okay,
So he played 7 years.
Yeah, so about 7 years with the franchise. I mean, to win 230 games in 7 years is. Over 230 games is kind of impressive. And not by kind of, I mean, it's very impressive.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, there's just nothing more you can really say about Luongo. I mean,
number 3 all-time on the wins list now.
Career stats, he pulls a 2.52 and a 9.19 in a regular season, a 2.49 and a 9.18 in the playoffs. I mean, what more can you really add for a guy over a 1,044 game career?
I mean, he's got what is his all-time win number at?
489 career wins.
I mean, come on. He's got almost 500 wins. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Posted, 77 shutouts in the regular season, but
I mean, the biggest knock on Roberto Luongo is that he doesn't have that Stanley Cup. But I mean, that's not his fault.
I mean, yeah. To be fair, for a long time, he played for a not so great, Florida Panthers team, and then when he came back to the Florida Panthers team again, they were good. I would say they were a decent team. They weren't good, but. He really never had a contending team until he was in Vancouver, and even then, we've said before, it was just they peaked at the same time as the Blackhawks, the Bruins, the Kings, and eventually the league kind of just passed them by.
Yeah. So, we'd like to extend again our congratulations to Roberto Luongo for having his number retired down in the Sunshine State. It's well deserved. And couldn't be a nicer guy, honestly.
Yeah, great player, even better person.
I mean, just great guy all around. And if you don't follow him on Twitter, I don't know what you're doing. But at Strombone1, I mean, you're really missing out.
He's a great player and a great guy for the game, a great ambassador for what it means to be a National Hockey League player. On that note, let's kind of get into the topic for today. Like I said, this is going to be kind of the last hurrah for some of these teams that we're talking about them here.
So what are our criteria for overall teams that are out of the playoffs? Because I mean I understand where we're coming from, but let's just lay it out for people so we don't get the comments why are the Blackhawks here? They're not that far out of the playoffs.
Right. So the Blackhawks are the closest team in terms of points to being in the playoffs. All these other teams, the Canadian, just to kind of preview, we're going to talk about the Habs, the Sabres, the Devils, the Senators, the Red Wings, Blackhawks, Sharks, Ducks, and Kings. So the only team that I was on the fence about putting them as outside of playoff contention was the Blackhawks. They currently sit, I believe, 6 points out of the wild card, which is currently being held by your Nashville Predators. So they are close. They're only 3 games away. The reason I put them on this list as outsiders is because of the moves at the trade deadline. So my criteria was either you're far out of the playoffs and you're not, like the Canadiens, okay, you're only 8 points out. That's 4 games. You still have 16, 17 games left. It's conceivable.
But in relative, in contrast to the teams around them who, teams in front of them are playing red hot right now, and the Canadiens are kind of still playing mediocre 500 hockey.
Right. And also it came down to moves at the deadline. Did the team kind of sell off? And, for all intents and purposes, the Blackhawks sold Robin Lehner. And I think really that was the indication to me, okay, playoffs is probably not in the big picture here because why would you trade away a goalie with a .920 save percentage if you're trying to make the playoffs. It just and start Corey Crawford, who's just not been good this year.
Right. And
That doesn't make any sense to me.
And not for nothing, but if you're talking about, they have both goaltenders are on expiring contracts, right? Corey Crawford's significantly older than Robin Leonard. Corey Crawford's, I think, close to 35 now, if not older. But and you have Robin Leonard, who's statistically
He's 28 years old.
28 and statistically the best goaltender on your roster right now. But I mean, I don't know.
That's why I put them on there, though. The biggest indicator to me was they traded Robin Leonard for Malcolm Subban and picks, and I was like, all right, like if you're trying to make a serious playoff push, you don't trade away Robin Leonard, who at that time was posting a .920 save percentage, and start Corey Crawford, who's 15, 19, and 3 with a .281 and a .916.
Yeah.
So that's why the Blackhawks are on here. I think all the other teams are pretty self-explanatory.
I mean, yeah, no one's gonna mistake the 16, 48, and 5 Red Wings for a playoff team, right?
So we're just gonna kind of go through and kind of talk about where the teams are at and whether or not this is part of the plan or part of a bigger picture and where the teams are headed and how we feel about them. And I think the team we should start talking about first is I want to talk about the San Jose Sharks, because this was a team that we both had in the playoffs. Now, granted, I think a large part of the reason we both put them in the playoffs was because of how perceivably weak the Pacific Division is, which at this point is kind of holding true. No offense to any of the teams in those divisions, but they're just not as competitive as the Stars, the Avalanche, or the Blues.
Right.
And I put them in the second wild card. You had them second in the Pacific. One of our other friends had them, I think, first in the Pacific. Let's just go. What happened, and where, was this part of the plan? What's going on in San Jose?
Right. So, yeah. Well, to make a long story short, was this part of the plan? Absolutely not. I mean, the San Jose Sharks were expecting to be in the playoffs this year, especially. I mean, but it looked bad from early on in the season when they weren't scoring and they had to call Patrick Marleau practically out of retirement to come save the team. Like, that's not. No offense to Patrick Marleau, but this isn't 21-year-old Patrick Marleau. This is 41-year-old Patrick Marleau. Like, he's can still skate kind of okay. He's still got good hands and he knows where to put himself on the ice. But I mean, he's not a go-to goal scorer anymore. I mean, he's not 40-goal scorer Patrick Marleau. So right there was a big red flag. And honestly, the biggest issue that you and I have talked about at length here at this point is that their goaltending has not been good and continues to be very, very lackluster. Because, I mean, let's be honest, Martin Jones is one of the most streaky goaltenders I think I've ever seen play. The guy can be red hot and play well, like, not even great, but just good enough for, a period of time. And then he looks like a college backup for other stretches. Like, he's not good. Their D-core is not great. Their forward core has been pretty much decimated with the loss of Joe Pavelski. I mean, it's just everything kind of fell apart for the San Jose Sharks all at once. And I guarantee you, not for nothing, but Erik Karlsson's probably regretting that long-term deal out there now.
Well, I think that's the biggest indicator to me in terms of, what happened. I mean, sure, okay. They've had a couple bad injuries. I know Hertl went down with an injury. Logan Couture's been out for a long period of time. But when I look at certain teams that have had bad injuries and have had success still, I mean, the Pittsburgh Penguins lost at any given point Crosby, Malkin, Letang, Gensel, Bjugstad. Dumoulin was out for a long time. So I don't really see injuries as being an excuse. And I mean, sure, do injuries affect some teams more than others? Yeah, but Connor McDavid went down for the Oilers and Leon Draisaitl came in and scored like 13 points in 4 games and they went, I think, 3-1. So I don't really think you can really blame it all on the injuries here.
I mean, not that it's the same thing, but the Rangers lost Mika Zibanejad for 13 games and managed to go 7-4-1 in those 13 games, losing their top center. And if anything, that's a comparable roster construction to the San Jose Sharks. I mean, they're younger, but in terms of the overall depth of the roster, like, it's not as deep as those other teams. So that was as big an injury as you could probably get, and they managed to survive. So,
yeah, I'm just, I don't think you can really blame it on the injuries, but I think they do have a legitimate issue where when your defense, the top 2 defensemen on that team are Erik Karlsson and Brent Burns. And maybe they don't play together as much. I don't really get to watch a lot of Sharks games, being that they're at 10 o'clock on, Eastern Standard Time where we are. But your top two defensemen that play almost every situation is Erik Karlsson and Brent Burns. When your top two defensemen are defensemen of that ilk, where very high risk, very high reward, Karlsson can't skate like he used to anymore.
Which, I'm just going to make a quick point, is I think Erik Karlsson now is a better defenseman than he used to be. He used to be a better player, right?
Right.
He was more high-flying, but I think he's a better defenseman now just because he can't skate the way he used to. So he's not
Yeah.
necessarily as high risk as he used to be.
Yeah, but it's just one of those things where...
He still can't play with Brent Burns, though. There's, like, no reason to put him on the ice with Brent Burns.
And the whole... The logic is that if you have these two out on the ice, sure, you're going to have some really nice moments where they make really pretty passing plays and they go in deep and make a nice play, score a goal for you. But if you have defensemen like that who are very prone to turnovers and very prone to, bad pinches and all that other stuff, you need a goalie that's going to be there to bail them out.
Right.
So if you're sticking Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson out on the ice and you have, like, Andre Vasilevsky in net, you're probably going to be okay more or less. But when your goaltender's Martin Jones, he can't make up for those defensive deficiencies. And the same thing goes, you lose Joe Pavelski, you lose a guy who plays a little bit of edge, you lose a guy who's always that net front presence, your captain, your leader in the locker room.
Your bumper player on the power play,
And then, sure, you still have, at that point, you had Brendan Dillon, Dylan DeMello is in Ottawa. They have Brendan Dillon, who's a solid defensive defenseman, but are you surprised at where they are, or are you like, this kind of makes sense?
Contrary to what my prediction says, no, I'm not surprised that the window closed in the San Jose Sharks, and it didn't just close. It slammed shut on them. It's done. There is no Stanley Cup hope for this, particular core going forward. They have good young pieces, right? They have Tomas Hertl, they have Kevin Labanc, they have some players that they're set up nicely with, but it's kind of time to just tear it down, and they need to replenish their prospect pool at this point, because...
Do you think it's more the Sharks got worse, or do you think it's that the division got better and younger?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? I don't think one happens without the other, right? Because the Oilers took a big step this year that nobody was expecting. The Vancouver Canucks took a giant step that nobody was expecting. Quinn Hughes, Elias Pettersson pretty much elevated that roster from, middling, kind of not great, to play like legitimate playoff contender with a real shot at winning a division. And then you add Tyler Toffoli, and it makes that team so much better. And, the Sharks, realistically, kind of... it was the issue we talked about. They were old, right? They're not a particularly fast team, and all the teams in the division got faster. Vancouver's fast, Edmonton is very fast, and only just got faster because they added, Andreas Athanasiou to play alongside Connor McDavid. So now you have two thoroughbred racing horses on the same line. And I really think that's what it is. They're kind of... They managed to extend their window longer than either of the other California teams. LA and Anaheim kind of fell off a cliff real fast, whereas San Jose managed to stay somewhat competitive for another couple of years. But I think it's finally caught up, and, for better or for worse, they're going to be kind of trailing those other California teams now. So at this point, they're kind of going to be the little brother in the division no matter what for a little while here, because... Right now, they're not going to be very good. They're going to be trying to, develop players. And then right when they start to get good is going to be around the time where LA and Anaheim should pretty much be finishing their rebuilds and be ready to compete. So they're going to be getting beat up on by those teams, right? So San Jose seems to have bad luck with this, where they're constantly peaking at the same time as other teams in their own division. They're still going to have a young Edmonton, a young Vancouver, and to deal with at the same time, so... But to go back to the answer to the original question, I think it's a little bit of both. I think the division got better. Those teams took big steps that nobody was expecting, and San Jose regressed in a way that nobody was... I expected some regression, but I didn't expect it to be as drastic a fall-off as it was, and it was drastic.
Yeah, and there's also an element to here, in my mind, of... Yeah, the teams around them got better. I think they were kind of victims of their own success in their the year that they went to the Stanley Cup Finals, right?
Right.
Was a year that nobody thought they were going to be at that level. We were saying, okay, at that point, even then, we were saying, well, the window's starting to close. things are starting to slow down for them. The other teams in the Western Conference are getting better. The Sharks don't really have it anymore, and then all of a sudden they go on this Miracle Cup run, and they get slammed by the Pittsburgh Penguins. But I think that kind of ended up hurting them because they said, oh well, that one year we made it to the playoffs, we just got hot.
Right.
Let's see if we can do it again. And I think that kind of has prevented them from starting to rebuild. And I mean, this year they're kind of not in a great position in the draft. They only have 3 picks in the first 3 rounds. They have 7 picks overall. They don't have any thirds and any fourths. I mean, I think this is kind of the price you pay for trying to extend your viability for so long. But yeah, I think this is going to be a pretty painful rebuild for the San Jose Sharks.
I don't know if it's going to be a Detroit level.
I mean, it honestly might be. They were in the playoffs for the better part of 15 years here. So I mean, and at that point, you're not really getting a chance to replenish your draft stock. So I mean, I feel bad for San Jose fans, but you're in it for a Detroit level rebuild. It's looking like here, and in that aspect, I don't know if do you think their front office is ready for it? Do you think like Doug Wilson is the guy for the job? And if not, do you make a move for a general manager who's a little younger, a little more ready to make, some more forward-thinking moves? Not exactly a Kyle Dubas, right? Because Kyle Dubas is kind of built a roster on a flawed idea of what hockey is here, right? I mean, just based entirely on the idea that it was all puck possession all the time and didn't really work out. But someone maybe like a John Chaika, forward thinking, but still has a hockey sensibility, who's built, a good, two-way team, 200-foot team in Arizona, which I think San Jose was kind of like when they were good. It was kind of like this kind of Arizona team, not a lot of high-end talent, just a good, hard-working team that was pretty solid.
Yeah, I ultimately would put a new captain at the helm here for one reason, and that's you never want to have a situation where you start a rebuild with the old guard, the old GM, right? And then 3 or 4 years in, you're not making the progress that you want to see, and you're like, you're still stuck in the old ways. And then you remove him and bring in a new GM, and now you have a new guy at the helm 3 or 4 years into a rebuild. Maybe his vision for the roster is different than the old guy's vision, and now that extends the rebuild by a couple of years because he's making moves to kind of correct what he sees as flaws. I think if you're planning on going into a hard rebuild for as long as you are, you need a guy that is in the long-term plans, and I think that goes for both as a coach and as a GM. You want consistency when you're building a team, and I think that's what Detroit has done really well with bringing in Steve Yzerman, because Detroit said, all right, like we're in it now, like we're in the swamp, and it's going to take a long time to get out of the swamp. Let's bring in a guy who's going to be here for the long haul. That way, ultimately, at the end of the rebuild, it's his vision.
Right.
You don't want to have a guy come in halfway through a rebuild, and now he has this motley crew of the old guy's theory was shot blocking and defensive suppression, and my theory is like high flying offense, and you get this like weird hybrid like a Minnesota Wild. Yeah, well, you get this Minnesota Wild type team where it's like what are we?
Yeah.
So I think
I mean, how many GMs have they been through at this point? Doug Fletcher, and then I don't remember anybody else.
Bill Guerin's there.
Bill Guerin's there now, and
I think that's a great point. I think I think the San Jose Sharks really need a new guy at the helm that's gonna buy in and tank out and just say
and that's not a knock at Doug Wilson by any stretch. I mean, Doug Wilson's easily. I mean, I think he's a Hall of Fame player already, but if he's not, I mean, there's no reason he can't get in as a GM at this point. I mean, what he did in San Jose is the initial, I think the first or second general manager in team history is incredible. It's nothing short of incredible. I mean, how many Western Conference final appearances, how many Stanley Cup final appearances? I think it was the one.
Yeah, one. But I mean,
still, to have a team at that highly competitive level for as long as he did, I mean, there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, well, I tried it, it didn't work, maybe it's time to start somewhere else. And he might be good for a team that's in a position to compete soon, right? You put him in a position on a team like that, and then he might be good at getting their competitive window extended and getting them to play well.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with it's not Doug Wilson as the problem. It's just like you said, you don't want to start with one guy and have him leave, like you said, and then be like stuck with this half and half kind of thing. Like you have an Arnold Palmer of a team, and it's not really like what you want.
And it doesn't set you up for success. I think ultimately, if you want a good example of that, you can look at what the New York Islanders are going through right now, where a lot of the team that is being GM'd by Lou Lamoriello was put there by Garth Snow. A lot of these contracts that he's having to navigate, he's been trying to get rid of the Andrew Ladd contract for 2 years. The Bailey contract was signed under Garth Snow. The Leo Komarov contract. A lot of these contracts that he's having to navigate were put there by Garth Snow, and unfortunately he's coming in at a time where he's trying to make the team competitive. And I do have my qualms with what he's done at this point, but he's having to navigate a minefield of bad contracts and less than stellar team composition at some points, because he walked onto a team that was pretty much set. And I don't think you want to have that situation in San Jose where you sit through a 5 to 10 year rebuild, bring in a new guy, and now you're stuck with the mess that the old guy made.
Right. It's not like a coach, right? A coach, in theory, you can bring in a guy that, like, good with young guys, pushes them towards, their competitive peak, and then you fire him and bring in a guy like maybe John Tortorella, like a John Tortorella character, who can then push them to their absolute limit and get them into, a competitive peak, Whereas, with a general manager, it just doesn't make a lot of sense, because a coach is doesn't have very little, but his effect on the organization isn't as organizationally deep as a general manager. So you can, in theory, during a 5 to 10 year rebuild, you could plan for 2 coaches. And you'd be like, okay, this guy we're going to try. We believe in this guy. We don't want to fire him, but if at some point he can't get him over the hump, we can bring in a guy that will kick them in the ass and get them over the hump. Whereas a general manager, you can't plan like that if you're the owner of the team. You need him to see from start to finish. He needs to get that team on the ice and ready. So I wouldn't be surprised if San Jose made a move like that, but in all honesty, I also wouldn't be all that surprised if they didn't do anything, because San Jose, if they're not anything else, they are a consistent franchise, and they have no reason to doubt Doug Wilson now. So I don't see why they would get rid of him after one bad year. I think maybe if it's a couple bad years here and they don't see, like you say, they don't see the progress they're getting, I don't think it'd be that detrimental for them to get rid of him then, as opposed to 4 years from now, 5 years from now, where he's already started the rebuild. Where 3 years from now, you can in theory still get rid of him and not have to navigate that minefield yet. So there's some play there, but I wouldn't be surprised either way.
So I think ultimately kind of what the conclusion that we're drawing on the Sharks here is that this was a disappointment of a year.
Yes.
And that ultimately this is a failure of a year for them. And we're both on the same page that the window's closed and we should really be seeing a blowing up and bottom out soon?
Yeah, I think so. I think next year you'll probably see the bottom out start. I don't think Jumbo Joe is going to come back for another year.
No. Not after what happened at the trade deadline, I don't think.
Where he literally told them to trade him and they couldn't.
So speaking of another team that I think is in an interesting position, I want to talk about kind of in tandem these two teams, but let's talk about the New Jersey Devils to start. We both predicted them to not be in the playoffs. I said they were going to be 12th in the East. You said they were going to be 11th in the East. They currently sit at 14th, 66 points. So let's kind of go through the same scenario here. How do you think the organization feels? Was this part of the plan? Are you surprised by any of this? Where are you at with the New Jersey Devils?
I think the Devils themselves probably feel this was a failure of a year, right? They were expecting playoffs or nothing here. Just look at the moves they made in the offseason, right? Wayne Simmons, PK Subban, the drafting of Jack Hughes. This was a year where they really thought they were gonna be in the playoffs, and they're not. And long story short, they're not. They didn't make the cut. They didn't fill any of the glaring issues in that roster, and Jack Hughes didn't exactly, not to blame it all on him, but he didn't exactly live up to the hype that he was given. He didn't step into the league like Austin Matthews or Connor McDavid did, and that doesn't mean he's a bad player. It just takes a little bit of growing, but
yeah.
It's just I think overall is a disappointment of the year, especially again when they don't address the issue of goaltending that they had. Again, there's nothing against Mackenzie Blackwood. He's been very good for them this year. He's got 21 wins. He leads all rookie goaltenders, but he's not the answer right now because the team in front of him is not good. It's just not.
Now let me ask you this, because the New Jersey Devils did make some moves at the deadline. they shipped out Wayne Simmons. They shipped out they shipped out Taylor Hall earlier in the year. The direction of the franchise. We've been talking about how it's kind of been a directionless franchise for a while after they fired John Hines and they fired the GM, and it kind of seemed like nobody knows or knew what they were doing or where this team was going. But they're in an okay spot because they're coming into this draft year. They got 3 first-round picks. I mean, they're conditional, obviously. So, assuming everything happens with those picks, they will end up with 3 picks in the first round. Now, they don't have any in the second or the third. But this being a draft that has been labeled as a pretty deep draft, how do you feel about the moves that they've made this year? Trading away Taylor Hall, trading away Wayne Simmons, shipping out Sami Vatanen, who was a rental. We knew that was going to happen, but getting those 3 first-round picks if all the conditions are met. How are we feeling about finally getting the Devils in the right direction for once?
Well, I think this finally, they finally don't look like a ship without a rudder, right? Like, they look like they've finally said, okay, well, maybe this wasn't the year, maybe this roster is not particularly ready, so we'll just steer the ship, and we'll bide our time and try to get younger, and get some players, So there's nothing particularly. I don't think they're in a particularly great spot. Oh, sorry. But I don't think they're in a particularly bad spot either. I mean, I think they know. It looks like they know what they're doing at this point. I mean, they still have to name a new general manager, I'm pretty sure, right? I'm pretty sure they've interim.
I think he's still on the interim tag, yeah.
So they still need a general manager, and that's going to be the biggest thing. Going into draft weekend, you don't want to go in without a general manager.
Right.
You want your guy before the draft.
Especially because there's a very strong possibility that these picks will be given to the Devils because the Lightning, the pick they acquired from the Lightning was Vancouver's, which the condition is the Canucks just have to make the playoffs. Otherwise, it's a first for next year. And the pick from the Coyotes, the condition is if it's 2020 top 3, it gets moved to next year. So the Coyotes aren't going to end up with a top 3 pick unless the lottery is very, very kind to them. Even if they miss the playoffs, they're likely falling in the 10 to 12 to 13 kind of range.
Yeah.
So there's a strong possibility that the Devils will end up with 3 first-round picks. And let me ask you this, because let's play a little GM here, because obviously the team looks like, especially it's weird after the trade deadline, they've actually played some pretty decent hockey. They've been beating some really good teams here down the stretch, and it looks like the team has a direction to start going in now where they're building around guys like Nico Hischier, Jack Hughes. They kept Kyle Palmieri. He's still got some term left on his deal. Mackenzie Blackwood has stepped in, and he's played really well for them post-trade deadline. So it looks like, if nothing else, they might have found their version of a Thatcher Demko. Now they just need a Jacob Markstrom 1A, or I think at this point Jacob Markstrom should be considered a bona fide starter, if not an elite goaltender in the NHL. But, so it looks like things are trending in the right direction. Would you be willing to maybe move some of these picks for a younger player, maybe a guy, in the same vein as like a 25, 26-year-old from another team who's like, all right, like we saw the Oilers trade, or the Red Wings trade away Anthony Ciu, even though he really wasn't that old. Would you be trading these picks, or are you taking these drafts?
I would like to see where the picks land first, but I mean, yeah, I'd be willing to move one or two of them to acquire, maybe a young defenseman to play on the roster, somebody that's ready almost sooner than, having to sit through maybe waiting 4 years for somebody after the draft. I mean, I don't know any, off the top of my head, any particulars that people would be looking to move. I mean, you're not going to pry, Eric Brandstrom or somebody of that caliber out of Ottawa, but, somebody of that ilk, a young elite puck mover.
Yeah, and we've seen teams move young defensemen just because of cap, implications.
Perceived cap implications, yeah.
The Rangers have moved out Brady Shea because they're worried about having to sign Tony DeAngelo. And one of the things we've heard is that, from Boston, a guy like Torrey Krug might be on the block because they're worried about signing other players. So do you think a guy like Torrey Krug would be a good fit for the New Jersey Devils for maybe 1 or 2 of those picks?
I mean, I wouldn't hate the pick. I think he'd add some welcome offense to the back end, which they're not getting from somebody like PK Subban. And not for nothing, Torrey Krug is a much better in his own end than PK Subban ever was. So I don't see an issue with it. Torrey Krug's not particularly old either. He's only 29, I think, something like that. So it's not like they'd be trading for a 35-year-old defenseman who's over the hill. So
Yeah, Torrey Krug is only 28.
yeah,
So he's the kind of player that we're talking about, where it's like, obviously, I don't think you're ever going to end up in a situation where a team is trying to trade a 19-year-old and they're willing to give you 2 first-round picks unless it's like a problematic 19-year-old like a Jesse Puljujarvi. But, you know,
do you think the Devils would be in the market for somebody like Jesse Puljujarvi if they could get him?
I don't see why not, only just because, you know, the Devils have been kind of like the Blackhawks East in that they're kind of a reclamation project. Like, they're just taking on players from other teams that they didn't want them, and they're turning them into valuable pieces. So I don't see why you wouldn't take on a guy like Jesse Puljujarvi if you can get him, because I mean, he's probably, at this point, you can probably knock Edmonton down and probably wouldn't even take a first-round pick because they just want to get rid of the guy. And then what? You trade for him, you bring him over, and if he doesn't work out, you're back at square one, so you didn't really lose anything.
Yeah, you don't really... The assets really weren't lost on him.
And he'd get the ice time that he wanted in New Jersey. I mean, that was his whole big thing, was that he wanted the ice time in Edmonton, and for, you know, some reason he just wasn't producing on their top 6. He got moved down and he wasn't happy with his ice time, this, that, and the other thing. I mean, he would be a good fit in New Jersey, I think. So yeah, I think we're kind of in agreement where I would, if I'm the general manager of New Jersey, I'm saying, like, I'm sitting here saying, okay, well, Nico Hischier took a big step up this year. Kyle Palmieri's still on the team for now. Why don't we, you know, and we made a dedication to getting better with the Wayne Simmons, PK Subban thing. Why don't we take a shot, and instead of drafting a player, why don't we see if we can trade for one? Because when you trade draft picks, you always have to think of it in terms of what are the odds of the player you picking turning into the player that you're trading for.
Right.
So when you trade, you know, a couple, like, say, 2 first-round picks for a guy like Taylor Hall, what are the odds that either one of those first-round picks is going to turn into a league MVP?
Right, and
I mean, not every first-round pick, or not even every first overall pick does that. I mean, look at Nail Yakupov.
Right. I mean, it's more about trading for it's quantity over quality. Like, it's trading for a known quality, with, you know, an unknown quantity, right? So you're throwing, like, it's a shotgun approach. You're throwing the picks at the other team, being like, listen, throw these at it. Some of these, they might stick. They might be a guy like Taylor Hall, but we need Taylor Hall right now. So we need him. We don't need what these guys are going to turn into. And those guys might turn into Taylor Hall league-leading MVPs, but, like... I don't know what happened there either, to be honest.
And the Devils are not in a bad spot in terms of their youth. I mean, they've had, you know, I pulled up some of their top players and top young prospects here. You know, they've got guys like Ty Smith, Michael McLeod, you know, Hischier, Jack Hughes, Mackenzie Blackwood.
And that's not even all of them.
And that's not even to name the guys that they got out of the Taylor Hall trade.
Yeah.
So they have quantity in terms of, they have a decent number of prospects. Now you're just, you know, they're not in a position like you said with San Jose, where, like, San Jose just needs players. They need young players. They need to refill the pool. You know, the pool is empty. It's starting to be summertime. People want to use the pool. We need to refill this pool. The Devils are kind of in a better spot, and
where the pool's full and people can play in it.
Yeah.
It's just maybe not the nicest pool yet.
No, we don't have the heated water just
right,
yet.
They don't have the lights in it. You can't swim at night, you know.
Would you be willing to move one of these first round picks for, like I said, like a Jacob Markstrom type goaltender? Obviously not Jacob Markstrom, although he's going to be a UFA and there's been talks about him. But, like, if you could, say, pry somebody out of another team, you know,
I mean,
would you be willing to move a pick for a goalie, or do you think that they should just say, we're going with Mac and whatever happens, happens?
See, here's the thing. I think Blackwood's been good for them, right? So I wouldn't push him out of the one role. I'd look for a guy that you could split him with, right? Well, 1A, somebody you can learn from. And I don't see why they couldn't get Jake Allen out of St. Louis, right? He's had a really good bounce back year this year after being really not great last year. And if nothing else, I mean, the guy's probably looking for an opportunity to prove to test his mettle and prove he can play. And if he can play 40 games, then why not? I mean, he proved he can play like 25, almost 30 for the St. Louis Blues this year. And granted, the St. Louis Blues are one of the best teams in the NHL, you know, defending Stanley Cup champion. So it's not, he's playing behind a very structured, very good team, whereas the New Jersey Devils aren't as structured as you would think.
No.
And again, it's not a shot at them, but they're a young team. They're just not there yet. I mean, no young team is as structured as they'd like to be. I mean, the New York Rangers aren't. Like, Carolina's not a particularly structured team. So, that might be a bit of an adjustment for him, but I don't see why a guy and he's not old. Jake Allen's 26, 27. It's not like you'd be trading for a 38-year-old Henrik Lundqvist, right? Like, it's not, this short-term fix. It's like, all right, well, if Jake Allen works out, he can stick around. He could be in the plan, So I don't see why guys you couldn't get a guy like that. Or like you said, even a Jacob Markstrom, actually Jacob Markstrom, because, hell, like you said, he's a UFA, and they seem to really believe in Thatcher Demko, so why not?
Yeah. I don't know that Jacob Markstrom is going to be available just based on the recent stretch of Thatcher Demko, but, I mean, even if they wanted to go out and get, maybe a Martin Jones, a guy who can just back up and play 30 games a year. He's not great, but, I mean, he wouldn't take that much playing time away from Mac if that's what you really wanted to give him.
Even an Alex Stalock, maybe, something like that.
Thomas Greiss is probably going to be on the market this year. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of coming to the same conclusion where, we are you surprised by any stretch by how the season went? Because me personally, I didn't think they were going to be a playoff team, but I didn't think they were going to be this bad.
I thought they were going to look more like the team we're seeing after the trade deadline. Playing more competitive games, playing meaningful games into March and April, kind of like what we said about the Rangers, right? We both said either of these teams could make it or not make it, but we expected them to at least be playing meaningful games well into the season. And right now the Devils aren't playing any meaningful games, and that's just because they had such a terrible start, which cost them cost their coach's job, their general manager's job, So I'm not particularly surprised by where they are. I'm more surprised with how they got here, with how bad that start was. I mean, it was horrendous. Blowing what was it?
It's
3-4 goal leads in 4 nights or something, something ridiculous. I mean, they on the opening night they blew a 4-goal lead to the Winnipeg Jets. So I don't know what that was about. So
are you confident in where they're going more so than you are with a team like San Jose?
Yes. Because I can see the picture in New Jersey. I can see where what pieces they have and where the pieces, what other puzzle pieces they need to fit in. Whereas with San Jose, you're starting with a blank canvas. You don't know where those pieces are. You don't know what they have, so you don't know where it's going to start slotting in, right? So I mean, even you can even say, oh well, they have Logan Couture, but Logan Couture is 30 years old.
Yeah, he's not a kid anymore.
So it's he's not. I mean, is he in the long-term plan? Probably, but he's not going to be the most effective player in the tail end of his tenure there. So I mean, not everyone's Joe Thornton who's playing until they're 42. So I'm more confident with where New Jersey's going than I am with San Jose for sure.
Yeah, I think we're kind of on the same page with that. Let's talk about one of the teams that to me has turned around my opinion of them in a very short amount of time, which is the Ottawa Senators. And boy oh boy, when you talk about rebirthing a dead franchise back from the dead, from the depths of hell basically for a long time with these guys. I mean, we all knew that they were going to be bad.
Yeah.
They certainly sit what's it called? They sit 7th in their division, 15th in the conference, 29th in the NHL. We both predicted them to be 16th in the East come end of the year. Clearly, that's going to be the Detroit Red Wings. But
I mean, neither one of us predicted the Red Wings to be as bad as they are. I mean,
this is historically bad.
I mean, we had them sitting. I had them 14th. You had them 15th, and we thought Ottawa was going to be worse. So, for all intents and purposes, we were pretty close. We just didn't think the Red Wings were going to be as bad as they are.
And clearly, this was part of the plan. I think there's no doubt in anybody's mind that this year coming in, the Senators were we're not going to be very good. We're just going to kind of accept that. We're going to let Craig Anderson play out whatever years he has left. But, man, when you talk about having a wealth of prospects, I mean, you talk about Eric Brandstrom, Drake Batherson, Logan Brown, Formenton, Brady Tkachuk, Thomas Chabot.
And then you might be adding Quentin Byfield or Alexei Lafreniere or the Swedish kid, whose name I just can't remember. I think his last name is Lucas Raymond. You might be adding one of those three to this already really potent prospect pool, and, it's impressive. This is a GMing job for the ages. Like, this is a really, really impressive.
Yeah, and I don't think, obviously, unfortunately, I don't think you'll be able to keep all of these pieces together. Some of these guys are going to price themselves out at some point. Just that's the reality we live in with the salary cap. But I think, obviously, we didn't think they were going to be good. But coming into this draft, I mean, they have 9 picks in the first 3 rounds. They have 3 in the first, and again, some of these are conditional, so assuming all the conditions go through, but they have 3 in the first, 4 second-round picks, and 2 picks in the third round. They have 13 picks in this upcoming draft.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about direction, right, this team very clearly has a direction, and there's a very strong leadership, organizational leadership going forward. Like, they very clearly believe in this idea and this philosophy, and they're sticking to it. I mean, and why not, right?
Yeah, and at this point, the only thing that's going to derail these Ottawa Senators is ownership. And unfortunately, the ownership of the Ottawa Senators has been in flux. I mean, their new CEO got fired after, 3 months of being on the job?
There's been so much infighting between the 2 owners of this team that it's been absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I still think they need to find a young goaltender, but with 13 picks in the upcoming draft, it's very, very easy to draft a couple of goaltenders and see if one of them sticks, So, I'm not even particularly worried about whatever goes on the on-ice product here. Yeah, they're not great right now, but, with 13 picks in this upcoming draft and all these young players, I'm not particularly worried about the Ottawa Senators being good at any point in the upcoming, 10 years. I think at some point they're going to be a very, very formidable team in the Eastern Conference. They're going to be fast. They're going to be able to score. I mean, you have Thomas Chabot on the roster, and he's locked up for another 7 years?
Yeah, and just to kind of jump in on those picks, there's only 1 pick in their first 3 rounds that's conditional, and that's the one from the New York Islanders, which is top 3 protected, which, again the Islanders, at this point,
they might not make the playoffs.
I'm not going to get into it because I'll be here for years talking about how frustrating this team is, but even if they don't make the playoffs, they're probably going to end up again in somewhere in the 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 hole.
Right.
So, for all intents and purposes, the Senators have 9 picks in the first 3 rounds. And there is, we've talked about this. I do want to talk about the goaltending thing because they really don't have a young prospect goaltender, right? There's really nobody in there that's going. I mean, they have Anders Nilsson, but he's kind of getting up there in age, and I don't really think he's the answer. And there is a Russian goalie who's projected to go top 10 in this draft. His last name is Askarov. Let me ask you this, because Russian goaltenders have been quite an interesting story in the National Hockey League these last few years. Obviously, it's a story that we're both intimately familiar with both Igor Shesterkin and Ilya Sorokin. These guys, when you draft them, you probably shouldn't be putting them in your 3-year plans, because more likely than not, they're not going to be coming over from the KHL within 3 years.
Right.
KHL contracts do not have NHL out clauses, so if they have a contract, they're stuck for at least however long that is, and a lot of them tend to come over at 24, 25, 26.
Right.
Do you think the Ottawa Senators should be leveraging some of these picks to go after a young prospect goalie, a la in the ilk of Spencer Knight?
If I was the Ottawa Senators, I wouldn't shy away from drafting Askarov because of the KHL factor, right?
Right.
Because he's talented, and he's really talented, and he really looks pretty like he's projected to be at least a number 1, if not an elite number 1 in the NHL, right? Those guys don't come around very often. Whereas you do have Spencer Knight, who, like you said, is also projecting to be an elite number 1, who's kind of log-jammed right now behind Sergei Bobrovsky. The only thing I wouldn't be opposed to drafting Askarov for is you have Craig Anderson, right? Craig Anderson could probably play out those 2 or 3 years. He won't be particularly good, but the team's not going to be particularly good, so you're not looking to be a playoff team, so it really doesn't matter who you throw in the net there. You could just throw some guy in. You could throw guys in there just to play. I mean, you're not looking to win 30 games with them. You're looking to maybe start them both 40, and hopefully they pick up 15 wins each, and then you're like, okay, we won 30 games, Show a little bit of improvement, then the rest of the roster shows improvement, whereas the goaltending is kind of just a stopgap until he comes over. I mean, I don't see why that couldn't be the approach, but I also don't see why they wouldn't want Spencer Knight. I mean, Spencer Knight has looked and talked about for since before he got drafted, since he started at the World Junior, since he came over and started this year at the World Junior and looked good. I mean,
he was the best goaltender in that tournament, and the number, who was the second best goaltender in the tournament? Askarov. So it's like, at this point, it's like you can't go wrong with either guy. It's really just like, what approach do you want to make? Do you want to trade for a North American goaltender who is in the country, on the continent, who at any point you could bring into your? I mean, he's committed to college right now, but at any point he could leave college, sign a professional contract, and come play for you the next day, or are you okay with waiting for? I mean, for all intents and purposes, Askarov could just not sign with a KHL team again and come back and come over this year after he gets drafted. I don't know what his KHL contract situation looks like, and I really don't know any way to look because it's kind of weird.
They don't really tell us
report
much
on it. Yeah, and it's not Cat Friendly's fault. It's just like KHL teams are kind of shady about their contracts. Like there's really, and then if you do find it, it's in rubles, and I really don't know how to translate that. So I really don't know what to make of any of it. But anyway, so it's really just it's more of a organizational philosophy than it is, going with a better player. It's more or less, do you think they're going to wait or not? And I don't see why they wouldn't wait for Askarov.
Yeah. The reason that I think if I was in this position I would be trading for a Spencer Knight is because I'm definitely drafting Askarov if I had the chance.
Right.
That's not a question. I have 3 first-round picks. What's the harm in taking a flyer on a KHL goalie?
And then worst case, you have 2 goaltenders you can leverage for something later.
Well, that's what I was going to say. With Spencer Knight, right? Like, so say, for example, the Ottawa Senators take a big step next year. Maybe they're next year's New York Rangers, where, granted, we both saw this coming, where they said, they're going to be playing meaningful games in March and April. But, let's be honest here, a lot of the hockey world really didn't, right?
Right.
So, what's to say they're not next year's New York Rangers? Now, obviously, the Rangers got a very big boost in a guy whose name is Artemi Panarin, and he really helped kind of seal this rebuild being over, more or less. But, what's to say? Maybe Thomas Chabot next year, he goes up and scores 20 goals. Brady Tkachuk hits 35. Logan Brown takes a big step forward. Colin White finally figures it out. I just think you'd want to have a situation where you have a goalie, like you said, that you can call up and can be the guy, and then you get Spencer Knight some NHL games while it doesn't mean as much, so there's not as much pressure on him, there's not as much stress, you can learn the game in the National Hockey League. Whereas if you only have Askarov, now maybe, oh god, now the team's competitive, but our goalie's sitting in Russia.
I think the other reason you might be a little more tempted to make a move for Spencer Knight is, like I said, he's here. And not even the call-up factor. You can have a really more hands-on approach to his development than you could for Askarov, who's in Russia, because, I mean, for all intents and purposes, an NHL team can call over to the KHL team, like, we want him to get more of this, and they'll be like, okay, yeah, sure, and then hang the phone up, and then never do it.
And you have no way of verifying.
Where if he's he's at college right now, but, like, say he signs an NHL contract after this college season's over and comes and plays in the AHL, right, or the ECHL, or wherever they want to play him, that's a very hands-on approach. The team is now directly involved in his development as a player. So you can then pretty much develop your team around him because you know what you have in net and you know what you want to turn him into because you know how you want him to fit into the rest of the team, which, like we said, Ottawa's already pretty much got the picture figured out. So you know how to slot him in. So, I mean, I don't think you can go wrong either way, but I can see what you're saying, and if after talking it through, I think I'd be leaning more towards trying to grab a Spencer Knight or somebody of that ilk than trying, hoping and praying for Askarov. But like you said, if I get a chance, I'm still going to draft Askarov.
Yeah, well,
there's no reason not to.
The Ottawa Senators are likely going to end up with 2 top 10 picks because one of the picks that they're getting is their own and the other one is from San Jose. So more than likely, they're going to end up with 2 top 10 picks. The Islanders pick can end up anywhere from, I think even if the Islanders make the playoffs, they're probably going to be out in round 1, maybe if they squeak by to round 2. So that Islanders pick is more likely going to be, if they make the playoffs, in the 16 to 19 position. If they don't make the playoffs, probably in the 12, 13, 14th position. So I don't see why you wouldn't go to Florida and say, like, you've got this kid who is going to be sitting behind Sergei Bobrovsky. And granted, sure, it's never a bad thing to have too many good goalies. Maybe they want to bring up Spencer Knight one day and have him play behind Bobrovsky, but at some point he's going to have to start. I mean, if his development meets his projection, there's absolutely no reason as to why he should be sitting behind Sergei Bobrovsky. And if you think about it, it's kind of like the Rangers. Like, the Rangers signed Georgiev, he was undrafted, right? And now they have Georgiev and Shesterkin, and now you have a good problem. Oh, now we have too many good goalies.
Right, and the biggest issue is Henrik Lundqvist, which is and not something I never thought I'd say, but Henrik Lundqvist has become an issue for the New York Rangers, and that's weird. But
Yeah.
like, you have Shesterkin, and it's the same problem that they're going to have with Bobrovsky and Spencer Knight. Shesterkin's development is meeting his projections, and it's kind of like, well, he can't stay behind Henrik Lundqvist. Like, there's no reason. So it's kind of that thing with what you're saying with Bobrovsky. It's like, all right, well, we have Spencer Knight, but he's now playing better than Bobrovsky, but we can't do anything about Bobrovsky because he's got a $10 million contract.
Yeah, 10 million over 7 years.
Right. I always get it backwards. I always think it's 7 million for 10 years, and I'm like, no, it's 10 million for 7 years.
But the good
Anyway.
thing for the Senators is that they won't have that logjam because Craig Anderson will be gone by then.
Right, and then the logjam will be Askarov versus Spencer Knight if that ends up being the situation, and a little competitive, good competition between players, healthy competition between two goaltenders, isn't a bad thing. It's really not.
It's never a bad thing to have too many good goalies.
Right, if they're both competing for starting time, I mean, eventually you're gonna have to solve it. But like at first, it might be a good thing because them competing against one another will probably push your team probably a little closer to the playoffs than you thought they would.
And then, oh no, we have to flip one of them, and we can only get like a first round pick out of it. Like,
Or
shucks.
Oh
you
no,
know,
or
like-
a blue chip prospect. Like we
Yeah.
trade for a good young player. So there's only positives that can come out of that kind of situation. I mean, unless both of them flop, but I don't think either one of them's going to. Like I don't foresee that. There hasn't been a really big draft flop in a long time. I don't think.
I think the last one you could really say was the biggest flop would be Nail Yakupov.
Yeah, who came into the league with all that hype? Yeah.
And I think ultimately, with 9 first round picks, you can afford to take a risk. Like I said, you're probably going to draft Askarov with one of the top 2, or the 2 of the top 10, right?
Right.
So you keep those 2, and then you flip the Islanders pick, so you give Florida a top 16 at worst, I think, a top 16 pick, and then you have how many 4 second round picks, so you can kind of be like, what do you want, 2 seconds for him? Like, here you go. You had the availability, and at this point they don't need the quantity because they have both the quantity and the quality. So
Right. Exactly.
yeah, so I think for the first time in a long time, I'm very confident about where this Ottawa Senators team is going.
Yeah, I think we're both in a pretty solid agreement where we kind of like where they're going. We've talked about a lot of these teams before. I mean, like we've talked about the Canadiens, so our opinions on the Canadiens are pretty well known at this point.
The only thing I do want to say about the Canadiens is that you can see how good this forward core is going to be. I mean, Cole Caulfield, Nick Suzuki, Ryan Poehling, Jesperi Kotkaniemi. That's not even to mention Drew Wen, who's only 24, and Max Domi, who's really not that old. So you can see where this forward core is going. I'm very worried about this defense and
Their goaltending.
Yeah,
Because Zach Fucale is not. I mean, like he dropped off the face of the earth. Remember when they drafted him?
yeah, I don't know where he's at now. I don't even know if he's still affiliated with their franchise.
I have no idea. I literally have no idea.
Is there another team on here that kind of jumps out at you that you want to discuss?
We could touch on the Sabres for a second. Like, are you we'll skip over most of it and get right to the point. Are you confident in the direction the Sabres are going, or do you see a direction where the Sabres are going?
No and no, because the Sabres only have 2 picks in the first 2 rounds of this year, right? They have their first and they have a second. They have 6 picks in this draft overall, which is the least out of any of these teams that I have on the board right now. The most is Montreal Canadiens, who have 14 picks in this draft. They have a first, 3 seconds, and 2/3. But the Sabres have 2 picks. They have a first and a second, no third, no sixth, 2/7. So that's where their 6 picks come from. And I just, looking at their depth chart, I mean, sure, you've got Dylan Cousins, Victor Olofsson, Rasmus Dahlin, Henry Jokiharju, who I don't know why they ever traded him away. Not the Sabres, whoever's traded it to him. I think it was the Golden Knights, maybe?
I think it was Chicago.
Chicago, yeah. I don't know why they traded away Henry Jokiharju, but
They got Alex Nylander for him, I'm pretty sure.
but you can see that they have some kind of blue chippers here, right?
Right.
Nobody that's really blowing you away besides maybe Rasmus Dahlin, but then they still have Rasmus Ristolainen. He's still good. They have a goaltending prospect, Pekka Luukkonen, who's supposed to be really good. But I look at this team and it's such a mess. I mean, you have Jack Eichel, who's a bona fide star in this league. He's an elite player,
Dude,
top end talent.
The Ike Daddy is literally dragging this team, kicking and screaming to relevance right now.
And it's not like we didn't see this coming. I put them at 14th in East. You put them at 13th. They currently sit at 13th. But in terms of direction, it's just I don't know how long you have to build.
Well, how long is Jack Eichel going to wait?
Right, because he's been there at this point for how long? 3-4 seasons?
However long McDavid's been in the league for, so 4 years now.
And McDavid's at least had that sniff of the playoffs. Jack Eichel has never even sniffed the playoffs. I mean, the closest they've come to the playoffs is being first in the Atlantic Division in November. And ever since then, for the past 2 years, it's been downhill. And to me, I'm not seeing any moves from management that's showing Jack Eichel that we're committed to winning. I mean, sure, you sign...
Well, you trade for Wayne Simmons for some reason.
You sign Jeff Skinner to that long-term contract after his 40-goal season, which, by the way, he's never going to hit again. He has not been very good this year. They did some statistic where it was like value of points, like your point total divided by your contract, and he's one of the worst players in the NHL in that regard. You know, they're paying way too much money for how many points he's putting up. But they never fix the issues. They never really address the goaltending. I mean, sure, you have Linus Ullmark, who's a good young goalie.
He's been good for them, but, I mean...
He's not good enough to get you into the playoffs, not in a division with Toronto, Tampa Bay, and Boston. And I don't know how you're fixing this. I think the goaltending is one. I think you have to get a goalie who can play now because, sure, I think Linus Ullmark, give him another year and a half, 2 years, you'll see him really start to hit that peak of legitimate NHL everyday goaltender. But can you convince Jack Eichel to stay on a team that's going to end up with another 84-point season for another 2 years?
That's really it. Is how long is Jack Eichel going to be willing to sit and wait for this? Because they're kind of realistically, I don't even...
I mean, again,
it's just a big yikes, honestly.
You have Jack Eichel, you have Sam Reinhart, you have Ristolainen, Dahlin, Jokiharju, Olofsson, but you've got to give Jack somebody to play with who's a legitimate player, and I'm not talking about a one-season wonder again. You can't go out and sign another guy who had a 40-goal season once and expect him to sit through that. And
I mean, he's playing. He's got Sam Reinhart. Sam Reinhart's a good player. He's playing to play with. I mean, he's been good for them.
I can't see this team having the assets to leverage to make a big enough swing that they can be competing with a Tampa Bay and a Toronto, because those two teams are going to be competitive for the next, well, depending on the cap situation with Toronto, theoretically for the next 3 to 4 years. I don't see it happening, and it's just frustrating because Jack Eichel deserves every bit a shot at the playoffs as any other player in the National Hockey League, even more so. And management over the last 2 years has had opportunities to solidify the team and make something out of it, and they just haven't. And I don't like the direction that the Sabres are going. Can they prove me wrong? Yes, but I don't see them with this current direction being a playoff team next year unless some serious overhauls made, and even a year after that, you're still competing with Tampa Bay and Toronto.
Yeah. And you're probably still competing with the tail end of the Boston window.
And if Florida ever gets Bobrovsky to be Sergei Bobrovsky, now you're competing with the Florida Panthers. And it's got to be a very frustrating situation for Jack Eichel, and I don't know. I was so excited for this team when they got Jack Eichel, and then they got Sam Reinhart, and they had Rasmus Ristolainen, and I was like, all right. And then you draft Rasmus Dahlin, and you're like, okay, like we've been too mediocre for too long, and it's just they're never taking that step. Like the Rangers you saw every year were getting a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better, right? Like
Right.
Even if not necessarily in the points, you saw it happening a little bit better this year, a little bit better this year. Okay, now we have Georgiev, the goaltending starting to finally figure itself out. Okay, now we've got a couple of guys coming up playing in the NHL. It's just where is the development? Because every year for the Sabres, they're the best team in November, and then after that, they're just terrible.
Yeah. I mean, they won 10 games in a row in November or December this year, and then all of a sudden, they've been playing below 500. They literally had such a good point percentage of the first 2 months of the season that they only had to maintain a slightly above 500 record through the rest of the season, and they couldn't even do that, and they would have been a playoff team.
Yeah, and
Then that's based on the projections of what teams were in the playoffs last year compared to the point percentages and that whole thing.
and not for nothing, but unfortunately, you also have to just kind of take reality into it, where you're playing in Buffalo. I mean, it's cold. It's upstate New York. Like, I have nothing against the city of Buffalo, but it's not
It's
exactly
a hard
like
draw.
it's not exactly like, oh, we didn't make the playoffs and we're in South Beach, Florida. Shucks. Like,
Yeah, like, oh no, I'm making $8 million to sit on the beach.
you're living in Buffalo, New York, which it's isolated up there. It's a long drive to any other major city. It's like 2 hours, like Syracuse, if you're gonna count that.
I mean, it's pretty much what every Canadian team has talked about. Their lack of competitiveness on the free agent market is because Canadian teams traditionally have to overpay either based on the value, and they usually have to pay out in American dollars because the exchange rate between the American dollar and the Canadian dollar is just not very good. So players only paid in U.S. dollars, which is whatever. That's pretty standard. Doesn't really matter. But the other problem is the level of having to overpay free agents to get them just to come play in Canadian markets, and Buffalo's kind of got that same problem. It's all of those northernmost teams. Your Buffaloes, your Toronto, your Torontos, your Montreals, your Edmontons, your Calgarys. Like, they have to pay more to get people to come play for them because they're isolated. Like, it's cold and it's winter until March, so like.
Yeah, it's just, and I feel so bad because I really do. I feel for Sabres fans because, believe me, I've been there for having just bad team after bad team after bad team. I mean, I didn't see the Islanders win a playoff series. Obviously they won one in, what was it, 2000 something.
It was 2002 before we started watching.
So I would say from when I really first started to understand the game, they made the playoffs. I mean, in my lifetime, the Islanders have made the playoffs. They played Pittsburgh, they played Washington, they played Florida, and then they played Pittsburgh. So in my lifetime, since I can remember starting really actually understanding the game of hockey, so give myself like 12 to 13 years of actually understanding the game, they've been in 4 playoff series. It's like I feel for you guys. I understand the frustration. It sucks. It's no fun having a mediocre team year after year after year. But unfortunately, and I think the only way that this is going to get better is to do what the Islanders did, and that's you're going to have to pay for a GM and you're going to have to pay for a coach. Like, I'm sorry. Like, the Islanders were going nowhere fast with Garth Snow or with Doug Weight. You're going to have to overpay for a legitimate coach. You're going to have to overpay for a legitimate GM. And to me, that's the only way that I see this getting better. And unfortunately, I don't know. I can't see it really. It's a tough scenario for the Buffalo Sabres. Yeah. I kind of don't want to leave it on a negative note for that team, but it is what it is.
Yeah, that's kind of it.
So let's, some of the other teams that are on here that we've talked about at length before. We talked about the Canadiens. We've talked about the Red Wings. Again, the Blackhawks could still make the playoffs. They're in that race. So would it surprise me if they made the playoffs? No. Technically, none of these teams except for the Red Wings are mathematically eliminated. But
it's pretty much impossible.
And we talked about, the Ducks and the Kings, like where we're at with them and where we think we're going. So let's kind of, let's hit this segment as kind of the wrap-up segment. Out of these teams, so out of Montreal, Buffalo, New Jersey, Ottawa, Detroit, we're going to skip Chicago. We're going to leave them out of this. San Jose, Anaheim, and LA. Out of all these teams right now, which do you think is A, trending in the right direction the most, and B, which of these teams could you see winning a Stanley Cup first? And we're going to leave Blackhawks out of this because they might even make the playoffs this year.
Yeah. I'm gonna go with the Senators. I think the Ottawa Senators are the team that's the most complete in their rebuild. I mean, they're not the furthest along in their rebuild, but the rebuild is the most fully realized. Like, it's the ideas are all there, and like we said, the only thing that's gonna hold them back is ownership. But for right now, the management's doing a great job. The coaching staff's done a pretty good job getting these guys on the ice and managing to keep them semi-competitive for the most part. So, I wouldn't be surprised if 7-8 years from now the Senators are playing for a Stanley Cup. I mean, this team is gonna be good. It's gonna be really good.
Yeah. I agree. I think the team that is best set up to make a Stanley Cup run the soonest is the Senators. I would say Montreal has an outside shot if all of their young players step up and they keep Carey Price and maybe they get a wonder run out of him at 33, 34. But I think Ottawa is the best set up for long-term success. Obviously, like I said, I don't think they'll be able to keep this core, all of it together. I think ultimately the core is going to end up being Thomas Chabot, Brady Tkachuk, Logan Brown, Alec Formenton. I think guys like Batherson, Rudolph Balcers, maybe even Colin White, they might be on the outside looking in just because where's my money coming from? And then, of course, you have to factor in paying a goaltender eventually. But, yeah, I mean, I think they have blue chippers at every single position, except for goaltender at this point. I mean, in the back end, you got Thomas Chabot and Brandstrom. On the wings, you got Formenton and Tkachuk. In the middle, you got Brown and Batherson. I mean, you've got guys at every spot. The only spot you really have to shore up at this point is the goaltending.
And not for nothing, when you're going to end up with probably a top 3 pick, so you're going to end up with either Alexis Lafreniere, Quentin Byfield, or Lucas Raymond. That's just another blue chipper to throw into the mix of other blue chippers. Like,
right, when you're getting most likely 2 top 10 picks in a draft that's projected to be pretty deep.
Right.
They're set up for success. I mean, ultimately, like I said, it's going to come down to can management navigate the ship and can ownership stick with it and make smart financial decisions. And I think ownership just needs to buy into what it means to be the owner of the Ottawa Senators and run a hockey team with a team that has, they had a lot of pride for a long time. They had a team that, was competitive. They were beating teams in the playoffs. Like, they beat the Rangers that one year. They've beaten, they went all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals to play the Penguins, lost in overtime.
I mean, they played for a Stanley Cup.
Yeah, it's just you have this team that has pride and you need to buy in and stop screwing them over. And it's just one of those things where the only thing that's going to stop the Ottawa Senators is
the Ottawa Senators.
And I think by the time they're really competitive, 3 to 4 to 5 years, I think this team could arguably make the playoffs in 2 years. Maybe be competitive for a Stanley Cup in, like you said, that 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 year range.
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, the Bruins will probably be at, trailing off in their dynasty. I mean, you're still going to have to deal with the Tampa Bay Lightning and the maybe the Toronto Maple Leafs,
some
depending
versions
on
of these rosters,
depending on the cap situation, and maybe the Florida Panthers figure it out by then. But I mean, really, at that point, Montreal probably have just been starting to upswing on their rebuild. Who the hell knows what's going on in Buffalo at that point? The Red Wings, I think, are in such a deep pit that it's going to take them 4 or 5 years just to be in the playoffs.
Yeah.
And that's not to say they don't have great prospects. They do, but I mean, it's just that's the price you pay for a 25-year playoff streak.
You literally have to have they have to draft players at every position at this point.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the Ottawa Senators are in a great spot, and the only thing that's going to stop them is themselves.
Yeah.
Is there anything you kind of wanted to touch on last minute before we wrap this up?
I guess just like notable events of the week, right? Like, not that I'm just a Ranger fan, but Mika Zibanejad becomes the first player since, what was it, Sergei Fedorov to score 5 goals in a game, including the overtime winner, and only the third Ranger in only third player in Ranger history to do it, outside of, I think it was Steve Vickers. It was Mark Pavelich in 1983, and what the hell was that rookie's name? He played in 70. It was in 76. Oh my God, why am I drawing such a blank? Anyway, but essentially just the third Ranger to score 5 goals in a game.
You know what I found really interesting actually the other day is that stat that popped up that said that I think it's I think it was Artemi Panarin, or no, it couldn't have been
It's
Panarin.
Zibanejad.
It was Zibanejad. It's the first Ranger to score back-to-back 30-goal seasons since
Jaromir
Jaromir
Jagr.
Jagr. And like, I know that Gabrick was only here for 4 seasons, but it
He ended up hurt.
kind of seems like really weird to think like that those hyper-competitive Rangers teams didn't have 30 goals. And I knew they were a defensive team, but I mean they still had players like Marion Gabrick, Derek Brassard,
Rick Nash.
Yeah, Rick Nash. I mean, Brad Richards wasn't really a goal scorer, but yeah, it was just very funky to me to think that the last Ranger to score back-to-back 30-goal seasons was Jaromir Jagr.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, like, that's because, was it Gabrick had the 41-goal season, got injured, had, like, 24 in, like, however many games.
And then he had another 40-goal season.
And then he got injured again. Oh, no, then it was the shortened season, and he got drove out of town.
Yeah. I don't know. That was just a very strange stat to me.
Oh, yeah, no, it was definitely interesting, but, like, Jaromir Jagr was an animal for the Rangers.
And if we're also going to talk about notable events, how about the Philadelphia Flyers? I mean,
Oh my God.
8 straight wins. They're challenging the Capitals for the top of the Metro. And I just want to stake my claim real quick. I just want to say something. Everyone's saying, oh, who would have saw this coming? Who would have thought that the Philadelphia Flyers were going to be competing for the top of the division? I had them as being second place in the division in September. So I just want to say, for everyone to say nobody saw this coming, I did. Hello, like, and I don't really get to say this very often because for some reason you've seen my playoff brackets over the years. They're always nuked in the first round. So I don't get to say this very often, but I was right about something for once. So,
I mean, if you look at it from like an objective standpoint, yeah, it makes sense. It's like, oh yeah, their young decor took the big step it needed to. They have Carter Hart playing like an all-star, and then you have a top 6 that's just solid. Like, it's just good. And they're getting contributions from everywhere up and down the line. And then at the trade deadline, they solidified it by getting 2 more centers, and Derek Grant and Nate Thompson to solidify their third and fourth lines. And Derek Grant comes in and he's got a bunch of points in those games. Like, it's, I don't know.
Can I ask you a question real quick too before we wrap up? We're gonna wrap up on this point. I was listening to Sportsnet 590 podcast, and Anthony Stewart at Stu Monroe on Twitter, if you want to go chirp him because he loves that. He said his pick for the Stanley Cup this year was the Edmonton Oilers.
Ew, what?
And I don't want this to come off as I'm down talking Anthony Stewart. I love the guy. I love
Yeah, he's fun to listen to.
Justin Bourne, Jeff Merrick, David Amber, and Truculent Fridays with Berkey when he's on Fridays. I love listening to that podcast. Listen to it every day on the way home. But he said that his pick for the Stanley Cup was the Edmonton Oilers.
Why? Why?
I mean, of all the teams in the West, do you see any team in the Pacific competing for a Stanley Cup this year?
I mean, no. The only team that I could see maybe doing it is Calgary, and that's just because they're bigger and stronger than a lot of those teams. So I think they'd be able to take the physical punishment that they're going to get from a Central Division team, but, like, Edmonton's not particularly deep up front. They're not that deep on the back end, and I wouldn't trust that goaltending as far as I can throw it, which, by the way, isn't very far because Mike Smith is like 6'4", like 230, and so is Mikko Koskinen.
String bean.
So, like, I'm not particularly
confident in their ability in net. I mean, yeah, am I ever going to bet against Connor McDavid? Not particularly, but in a 7-game series, yeah, I'm going to bet against Connor McDavid because a better team's going to win. The better player is not going to win. The team is.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask you that because I found that really funny. And again, I'm not talking down to Anthony Stewart.
No,
I love all those guys, but I listened to that and I was like, I agree with a lot of what Anthony Stewart says, but I was like, really?
Yeah, like that's that's the hill you're gonna die on.
You also need to stop using those multicolored pens, according to everyone on Twitter. So who knows about that one? But
yeah, I don't know about that one. Those are fire.
I doubt they'll ever hear this, but if any of you guys in the Sportsnet podcast ever hear this at some point, love you guys. You guys are great, and I listen to you guys every day.
If you ever want to sit down and argue with us about why the Edmonton Oilers are Stanley Cup champion, Anthony
I'm gonna
Stewart,
call him out. I'm gonna tag him on Twitter. Like, at Stu Monroe, you're wrong. All caps.
We'd be more than happy to have a friendly conversation with our not our good buddy, but Anthony Stewart.
Just
about
don't call
his-
your brother in. I don't want to get beat up by Chris.
Yeah, please don't.
I'm gonna get fed a knuckle sandwich by Chris Stewart.
Yeah, please don't.
But yeah, okay. So that was more or less our take on the outsiders looking in. Things are looking great for the Devils and the Senators. Red Wings fans, just stick with it. It's gonna be really, really painful, but just stick with it. You guys have a good thing going. You finally bought into the rebuild. It's gonna suck, and you're seeing this is a historically bad team, but stick with it. You guys are in a good direction. Sabres, please fix yourself. For the love of God, I want to see Jack Eichel in the playoffs.
Dude's absolutely electric, but like you never see him past game 82 because the general manager can't figure out how to get this team into the playoffs.
Montreal, you have great forwards. Should probably
Maybe
consider tearing it down completely, trading Shea Weber, all this, that. Sharks, God help you. Sorry. Ducks and Kings, again, just buy into the rebuild. It's over. And the only other one is Blackhawks, who might even make the playoffs this year. So
Yeah, who knows what the Blackhawks are gonna do?
so that was kind of our last take. Again, we're probably not going to mention these guys again unless some big news happens, or, you know, the next time you'll hear us talk about any of these teams is going to be
Probably
the draft.
yeah.
So,
The only team we might talk about again is probably the Blackhawks, and that's if they make the playoffs.
right, because they're still in that push. They're only 6 points back. Although they did lose to Detroit the other day. Big 2-1 victory for the Detroit Red Wings.
Yeah, I don't know how they did that. Where was
Um,
Showtime when you needed them, right?
He was the only Blackhawk that scored, actually. It was
I know.
really funny. But
Which is the best part.
yeah, so for fans of these teams, I hope you keep listening, but unfortunately we're probably not going to be talking about these guys for a while. But stick with it. Believe me, coming from an Islanders fan, I feel you guys. I know what it's like to be... My team was rebuilding for 20 years, so...
Something like that. Oh, jeez.
So having sit through a 20-year rebuild, I know it's painful, but it's going to happen. And yeah, so from here on in, it is playoff race time. We're going to be talking about all these playoff teams. And at this point, would I like to see the Islanders in the playoffs? Yes. But I am so amped up for these playoffs in particular that even if the Islanders don't make it, I am so ready to watch playoff hockey. I am so excited to see guys like the Canucks, maybe even the Arizona Coyotes, they can figure it out. I'm just amped to see, if Connor McDavid and the Edmonton Oilers can stick with it. I am so ready for playoff hockey at this point. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be electric, and this playoff push is going to be so much fun to watch. So thank you guys for watching, and we will see you guys next time.